In this video, I will discuss the pitfalls in organizing and visualizing variables. When organizing and visualizing data, you need to be mindful of the limits of others' ability to perceive and comprehend, presentation issues that can undercut the usefulness of methods from this chapter. It is easy to create summaries that obscure the data, create false impressions, or contain chart junk. So this is one example of very bad presentation. This is information overload. There's too much information on this graph. So when someone sees this, it's really hard to comprehend what is what, because you have so many different colors and so many different categories all on one graph. So this is not a graph that you want to present. This is a very bad graph. You can also create false impressions by using selective summarization, and that's when you present only part of the data collected. You can also improperly construct charts. So you can have potential pie chart issues, improperly scaled axis, a y-axis that does not begin at the origin or is a broken axis missing intermediate values. And you can also have chart junk. So if you look at these two pie charts, you would not know that both of these pie charts represent the same data. They summarize the same data. Um, so what you need to do to improve it, you probably would need to add percentages on there and have a scale on the side so you know what color each color represents. So this is the market share of companies. So if you have different companies, you may want to say the dark blue represents Microsoft. The green represents Best Buy. So you have to label the chart correctly so people know what's indicated on the chart. This is also an example of bad presentation. For example, this tells you the frequency of the number of A's received by students in each class. This graph will be better represented with percentages. And the reason why is, so if you look at the freshmen, you have 250 freshmen that received A's. Okay. However, there might be 1,000 freshmen in the class. Okay, so let's say this is 250 out of 1,000. And then for the sophomores, as you can see, it looks like 150 sophomores got A's, but out of how many sophomores? So let's say they have 300 sophomores. So if you were to divide this out, we can say 25% of freshmen got A's versus 50% of the sophomores that got A's. So you really need to be careful. All because the freshmen had the most A's, you have to look at the number of freshmen, the number of sophomores, juniors, and seniors within each of those categories. So this will be better represented with a percent graph. This is a percent bar graph over here on the right. Another way you can have data that does not tell the whole story is by compressing the vertical axis. So if you look on the left hand side, this vertical axis goes from 0 and it jumps to 100. And so these bars are kind of low. You really can't get a good feel of what the percentages would be or the amount. This is sales. So you really can't get a good idea of the monetary amount for each one of these bars because the vertical axis is compressed. So if you don't compress the vertical axis, if you instead of going from 0 to 100, you go from 0 to $25, and then you can have a better picture of what the quarterly sales are. Okay. Another bad presentation is when there's no 0 point on the vertical axis. If you look over here to the left, you have a graph. It does not start at 0. So you always have a 0 starting point. If you look over here on the right, there is a 0 starting point. Now the graph, it doesn't really change much. It's still shaped the same, but it is, I think this one on the right is kind of pushed up more because of you have the 0 starting point. So you always start with that. Another bad presentation is when you have chart junk. Now, I know people want to create graphs that are colorful and pretty or what have you, but sometimes you just want to get to the point when it comes to graphs. So in this graph, this is a bad presentation because they tried to be creative. And this is what these graphs are displaying is the amount of land planted with grapes for the wine industry. So what they did was, it looks like this is a grapevine. So, they tried to throw in a picture, and the first part here, it says 1949 to 1950, they had 135,326 acres of land. And then it dips down from 1959 to 1960 to 130,201 acres and so on. So this graph is displaying a little bit too much. You got too much writing, you got pictures, it's just not a good graph. So the way to get to the point, why not just use a time series graph? So that way you can see the acreage over time. And that's what you see over here on the right. So instead of putting 1949 to 1950, you have time on here, 1940, 1950, 1960, and then you can plot the number of acres that will be on the y-axis. Okay? So the best practices for constructing visualization is to use the simple possible visualization. Include a title and label all axes. Include a scale for each axis if the chart contains axes. Begin the scale for a vertical axis at 0 and use a constant scale. Avoid 3D or exploded effects and the use of chart junk. Use consistent colorings in charts meant to be compared. And avoid using uncommon chart types, including radar, surface, bubble, cone, and pyramid charts.